The wind howled across the cold Atlantic waters, tugging at the edges of the present and echoing whispers of a time long buried beneath steel, salt, and sorrow. Long before the great ship's bones rested silently on the ocean floor, it had breathed with life, with laughter, with dreams brimming over its decks and within its gilded walls. Its name was Titanic, the ship of dreams, and to those who boarded it in April of 1912, it was nothing less than a floating city of hope. Rose DeWitt Bucator was 17, and she moved like she was part of some painting too intricate for the everyday. With her chestnut hair pinned high, her emerald eyes absorbing the world with quiet resignation, and her corset pulled tighter than the lies of the world she inhabited, she stood on the upper deck, surrounded by the refined airs of first class. Her mother, Ruth, clutched her arm tightly, as though she might float away like one of the hats people lost to the sea breeze. Ruth smiled and waved at no one in particular, her face permanently affixed in an expression of social ambition masked as grace. They were not there for adventure. They were there to solidify an arrangement, a marriage to Callan Hockley, heir to the Hockley steel fortune. Ruth's gaze kept drifting to Cal's pocket watch, its gold sheen catching sunlight, as though it were a talisman that could ward off the creeping threat of financial ruin. Rose, however, was drowning in a different kind of abyss. Below deck, where the atmosphere shifted from polished brass to bare steel, the pulse of life beat faster. There was laughter, raw, unrefined, and real. Jack Dawson had won his ticket to Titanic in a poker game just minutes before departure. His heart thudded with the excitement of fate's favor as he clutched the paper that bore his passage from Southampton to New York. He was 20, a sketch artist from Wisconsin who had spent the last 2 years drifting through Parisian cafes and smoky alleyways in pursuit of stories to draw and lives to live. He didn't have money, but he carried something far rarer: freedom. As the Titanic's horn blew its farewell to the old world, Jack leaned over the railing with his best friend, Fabrizio, grinning like a child staring down an open road. "I'm the king of the world," he yelled, arms wide, laughter carried by the wind. And for a fleeting moment, he was. The days that followed saw Titanic glide across the Atlantic like a cathedral of ambition, slicing through water with a certainty that dared the elements. Inside its walls, opulence reigned in first class. Crystal chandeliers glimmered over 10-course meals. String quartets played softly as people danced in ballrooms, and fine china clinked politely amidst the hum of orchestrated conversations. But no elegance could soothe Rose's unrest. Her life had been charted like the ship's course, precise, immovable, inevitable. It was on the verge of one such inevitability, in a gown that felt more like armor, that Rose found herself suffocating. The laughter of the deck, the shallowness of Cal's compliments, and the iron cage of her future converged into a moment of clarity as sharp as broken glass. As night fell, she ran, past the prying eyes, the gasps, the pleas, and found herself at the stern of the ship, her gloved hands gripping the railing, eyes staring into the void of stars above and blackness below. Jack had been wandering nearby, sketchbook in hand, observing the elegance of the upper decks from a distance, unaware that fate was about to change direction. He saw her silhouette first, elegant, solitary, still, then her foot on the rail. "Don't do it," he said, not with panic, but with a kind of casual conviction that caught her off guard. "You jump, I jump, remember?" She turned, startled, not by his presence, but by the absurdity of the moment. "You don't even know me." Jack shrugged. "I know what standing at the edge feels like. I know that your shoes are too tight, that your voice sounds like it's always trying to be quieter than it wants to be, and that whatever's going on in that perfect life of yours, it's not enough." She hesitated, the air between them filled with questions they hadn't asked and truths they hadn't shared. Slowly, she allowed herself to be pulled back over the rail, trembling as she landed. Jack's coat found her shoulders. Her eyes, grateful, shocked, unsure, found his. That night, Cal arrived in a rage, accompanied by his valet and a crowd that had only heard that a young woman had nearly fallen overboard. Jack stood awkwardly beside her as she lied to save face. She had slipped, and this young man had pulled her back. A story born not out of panic, but preservation. Cal, both relieved and threatened, offered Jack a reward, a polite gesture masking disgust. Jack declined, but accepted an invitation to dine in first class. Dinner that evening was a collision of worlds. Jack cleaned up with help from Molly Brown, the unsinkable socialite who saw past his clothes and into his spirit. The dining room shimmered with candlelight, cutlery, and conversation, but Jack stood out not because he didn't belong, but because he didn't care to. He made Rose laugh, truly laugh, for the first time in what felt like years. Later, when he showed her the sketches in his portfolio, drawings of workers, mothers, dancers, lovers, the lost, and the joyful, Rose saw the world she had never been allowed to know. He saw her for who she was, not what she was supposed to be. The days passed like whispered secrets. They walked the decks under the stars, hiding in plain sight. Jack showed her the third-class party, raw music, spinning feet, fire in every smile. She danced without corsets, without permission. They breathed as though they'd never breathe this freely again. But reality pressed hard. Cal grew suspicious, then possessive. Ruth reminded Rose of her duty, of legacy, of debt. And yet, in the quiet moments, Jack and Rose created a world apart. A world where he asked her to pose for a portrait. Nothing more than the girl she really was, wearing nothing but the heart of the ocean, the blue diamond gifted by Cal. She agreed, not out of rebellion, but truth. In that room, candlelit and intimate, Jack drew her as he saw her, confident, unafraid, alive. She signed the portrait with a flourish and left it in Cal's safe, a silent declaration. Their escape that night was sudden, spontaneous, and electric. Chased by Cal's valet, they ran through the ship like sparks over dry grass. They found a car in the cargo hold, their passion igniting inside, a love unbound and undeniable. Fingers traced skin, breath met breath, and they crossed a threshold no steel gate could contain. Then came the iceberg, a scrape, a shudder, a pause. At first, the sound was strange but forgettable, just another sound in a ship full of them. But below, in the bowels of Titanic, rivets burst and seawater rushed like wolves let loose. Men in the engine room didn't scream. They just moved, fast, silent, professional. The crew began to stir. Officers whispered. Stewards knocked politely at doors. Titanic was bleeding. And so, the dream began to unravel, not in screams or sirens, but in questions. Gentle at first, then louder, then panic. Jack and Rose emerged from the car, breathless and glowing, to find chaos growing around them. The tilt of the floor, the urgency in the crew's voices, the coldness of the wind. Rose looked to Jack, and Jack looked to the sky. Stars still shined, but something had shifted. The night was no longer theirs, and beneath their feet, the sea waited. The silence didn't last long. The faint vibration underfoot, the almost imperceptible shift in gravity. These were the signs that something had changed, that the invincible had been wounded. Rose clung to Jack's hand as they climbed the stairs from the cargo hold, hearts pounding not just from passion anymore, but from a growing, unfamiliar fear. Crewmen brushed past them, stiff and silent, their faces holding back something not meant to be seen by passengers. "What's happening?" Rose asked one of them, her voice still breathless. "Nothing to worry about, miss. Just some precautionary checks. Back to your stateroom, please." But Jack saw it. The strain in the man's jaw, the flicker in his eyes. Something was wrong. He pulled Rose aside. "That wasn't a bump. I felt it." The whole ship shifted. Rose looked at him, her pulse racing. "Do you think we hit something?" "I don't think," Jack murmured. "I know." All around them, whispers grew into murmurs. Doors creaked open. Men in tuxedos stepped into hallways while women peered out from their suites, adjusting silk robes. Then came a call for lifebelts. Not shouted, not screamed, just suggested. The music still played in the first-class lounge, as if defiance could stop water. Jack and Rose rushed up to the boat deck, pushing through the growing crowd. Crewmen were working feverishly, uncovering lifeboats, swinging them out, ropes groaning under weight, not tested since Southampton. Captain Smith stood on the bridge, his face as gray as the clouds above. He had received the reports. 6 compartments flooded, the bow dipping slowly but surely. Thomas Andrews, the ship's builder, was nearby, running calculations in his head faster than any slide rule could manage. "She'll sink," Andrews said, not with drama, but cold certainty. "She's made to stay afloat with 4 compartments breached. Not 6, but this ship can't sink," First Officer Murdoch said flatly, as if refusing to believe the words he heard. "She's made of iron, sir," Andrews replied, his voice calm and steady. "I assure you, she can, and she will." Down below, the third-class passengers were still being told to wait. Gates were locked, not out of cruelty, but out of policy. Immigration needed to keep the classes separated. But that policy would soon become a death sentence for many. Jack and Rose rushed through the hallways, seeking out Rose's mother and Cal. The chaos was escalating. Stewards were handing out lifebelts, urging people to remain calm. But the tilt of the floor was now undeniable. Rose felt it. Everyone did. When they reached the stateroom, Ruth was stuffing jewelry into a case. "Where have you been?" she demanded, eyes narrowing. "What have you done with her?" "I've been with him," Rose said firmly, standing straighter than ever before. "And I'm not sorry." Cal, who had been pouring himself a drink, turned slowly. "So it's true," he muttered. "You'd rather be with that gutter rat than with me." "I'd rather be with someone real," she snapped. "Someone who sees me, not someone who owns me." Cal stepped forward, but Jack didn't flinch. "We don't have time for this," he said. "The ship's sinking." Ruth gasped. "Don't be absurd." "It's true," Rose said. "We need to get to the boats." But Cal wasn't ready to let go. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat. "Funny, then, that I found this in my safe." The sketch. Jack's drawing of Rose wearing only the diamond. Cal's hands trembled slightly. "You'd humiliate me like this?" For a fling in the boiler room. Rose didn't answer. She simply turned to leave. But Cal reached into his pocket and pulled out something else, his coat. He offered it to her, suddenly sweet. "Take it," he said gently. "You'll be cold on deck." She hesitated, then took it. Only later would she realize what else he'd placed inside. The boats were filling slowly. Too slowly. Most were being lowered half empty. People refused to believe they were in danger. After all, this was Titanic. Lifeboats were just a precaution. The night was still calm. The band played Alexander's ragtime band to keep spirits up. Laughter still rose in places where fear hadn't yet reached. Rose's mother was already being escorted to a boat. Ruth looked at Jack, then at her daughter, and said only, "This is not a time for rebellion, Rose. Come with me." But Rose stepped back. "Goodbye, Mother." Ruth's eyes widened, and then she was gone, lowered into the Atlantic in Boat 6. Jack grabbed Rose's hand, and they ran, not just from Cal or from the ship, but from everything that was supposed to define their lives. They darted down to the lower decks, searching for a way to help, to warn others, to survive. But then the trap was sprung. Love didn't come without cost. Cal's valet, Lovejoy, intercepted them. He accused Jack of theft, of stealing the heart of the ocean. The diamond had been slipped into Jack's pocket, planted with precision. Officers swarmed. Jack was handcuffed, dragged away. Rose screamed. No one listened. Cal leaned in. "You're not part of her world," he hissed. "You never were." And then, with galling smugness, he added, "But I'll make sure she gets off the ship, even if it kills me." Rose was torn between duty and despair. They led her toward a boat, told her Jack would follow. She sat trembling in the lifeboat, watching as the deck drifted away. Below, passengers cried out, desperate to board. Children were lifted, some mothers left behind. As the lifeboat lowered, she looked up and saw Jack, still in handcuffs, screaming her name. That was all it took. She stood. "Miss, sit down," the officer shouted. But she didn't. She climbed, barefoot and fierce, back onto the deck of Titanic. Rose ran, through steam, through smoke, through panic. She found Andrews in a corridor, looking ghost-like, handing out life jackets like a priest giving last rites. "You must get to a boat," he urged. I need to find Jack. He looked at her for a long moment. Good luck to you, Rose. She ran, heart hammering, dress soaked with seawater creeping up the corridor floors. When she finally found Jack, chained in a master-at-arms office, he was barely conscious. Her hand shook as she searched for keys. None worked. Get the axe, Jack whispered. What if I miss? She asked. He grinned weakly. I trust you. She swung. Metal shattered. His wrists were free. They were out again, racing through freezing water that now reached their knees. People screamed. Pipes burst. Light flickered. The bow was sinking faster now. The ship groaned like it was alive, in pain, its soul cracking with every rivet. They reached the upper decks again. Chaos reigned. The tilt was now steep enough to make standing difficult. The band had stopped playing cheerful tunes. They began the hymn, Nearer, my God, to Thee. Rose clutched Jack's hand tighter. Cal reappeared, pale and unsteady. She's out of place, he told Jack, finally defeated. She'll be safe. That's all I ever wanted. Jack didn't answer. He pulled Rose close and kissed her, as if it were the last time. Because it might be. Then the ship lurched. The stern rose higher. Screams filled the night. The final plunge was coming. The groan of the ship twisted into a scream of metal against water, of man's arrogance against nature's mercy. Titanic was dying. Not slowly, not silently, but violently, dramatically, in front of everyone who had once danced on her decks and toasted to immortality. Her bow had vanished beneath the waves, swallowed by a sea so black it may as well have been the sky inverted. The stern was rising now, lifted like a fragile toy in the hands of a furious god. Jack gripped the railing with one arm, the other clamped tightly around Rose's waist. Around them, people slid across the tilting deck, some clawing for lifeboats long gone, others frozen by disbelief. An older couple lay entwined on their bed inside their stateroom, holding hands as water lapped at the lace of the covers. A mother whispered lullabies to her children in a third-class cabin. The end was not democratic. It came for rich and poor alike, and none could escape its grip once the time came. Don't let go of my hand, Jack said. His voice was steady even now. I won't, Rose whispered. Not now. Not ever. They climbed, step by painful step, as the stern lifted higher and higher. The deck now stood at a steep angle, turning the once majestic promenade into a cliff. People were falling. Some screamed, others didn't, as gravity did what panic could not. Jack led them to the very back, where the rail met open air and the ship's final elevation gave them a chance to breathe. Hold on to the railing, Jack shouted. Just like this. Rose nodded, teeth chattering. Her hands clamped onto the freezing metal, knuckles white. All around them, chaos blurred into a kind of silence, as though fear had muffled the world. They dangled, suspended in time, waiting for gravity to make its final decision. And then, with a final shudder that ran through every bolt and beam, Titanic broke. The noise was indescribable. The spine of the ship snapped with the force of a mountain crumbling. A boom, a groan, then a deep-throated roar. The stern teetered, balanced for a heartbeat, then fell back to the sea with a thunderous crash. The water rushed in with the fury of a dam breaking, dragging everything with it. Jack and Rose were hurled into the ocean. She hit the surface like a stone skipping once before being pulled under. Freezing water stabbed her lungs, her heart. She clawed upward, hair a veil around her face, eyes stinging with salt and tears and desperation. When she broke the surface, the sounds returned. Screams, splashes, chaos. Jack, she called out, spinning, gasping. Rose, his voice came, just as frantic. He fought the waves to reach her, grabbing her arm as another man tried to climb over them. Jack punched him back, holding Rose close. Swim, he yelled. Swim away from the suction. The stern began to disappear now, lights flickering like dying fireflies before the darkness claimed them. Titanic, the great unsinkable, groaned one last time as it was pulled into the deep. Water closed over it in silence. And then nothing. No ship, no light, just the stars above. eternal and cruel, and a sea full of desperate survivors floating among the dead. Jack and Rose clung to each other in the freezing water, but they knew they couldn't stay that way for long. There, Jack pointed. A broken piece of wood, a panel, probably a door or wall from the first-class lounge, floated nearby. He helped her up onto it. It barely held her weight. When he tried to climb on, it tipped violently. "You'll sink it," she cried. He nodded grimly. "I'll stay in the water. You're going to get out of this." "No," she sobbed. "Jack, listen to me," he said firmly, his teeth chattering. "You're going to live. You're going to go on. You're going to die an old lady, warm in her bed. Not here. Not like this. Not tonight." She shook her head, tears freezing to her cheeks. "Promise me, Rose." "I promise," she whispered. He kissed her hand, then leaned his cheek against it. The stars reflected in his eyes. Minutes passed. Hours. The screams grew quieter. The ocean claimed more than bodies. It took voices, warmth, hope. The cold was not just a temperature now. It was a thing, a predator. It crept into the heart, numbing thoughts, stealing time. Rose felt herself drifting. "Jack," she whispered. No answer. She touched his hand. Still. Frozen. Gone. "No," she breathed. "Jack." She tried to wake him, to shake him, to will warmth back into his skin. But he was gone. She sobbed silently, alone on the raft of death and memory. Around her, the sea lay still, the stars unmoved. Then, distantly, the sound of a whistle. She raised her head. A lifeboat. Her limbs felt like stone, her body nearly immobile. But Jack's voice echoed in her head. "Don't let go." She reached for a nearby steward's whistle, still hanging from a lifeless body. Her fingers barely closed around it. She brought it to her lips and blew. Once. Twice. The lifeboat stopped. They turned toward the sound and rowed. She was saved. They pulled her into the boat, blue and stiff, but breathing. Alive. The Carpathia arrived at dawn. A ship summoned by radio, by frantic calls in the night. Too late to save most, but just in time to gather the broken pieces. Titanic was gone. Over 1,500 souls were lost. But Rose was among the survivors, wrapped in blankets, sitting on the deck of a ship that felt like a ghost. Cal was there, looking for her. She saw him, but didn't speak. Instead, she gave her name as Rose Dawson. That night, as the Carpathia sailed toward New York, she stood at the stern and reached into her pocket. The heart of the ocean was still there. Cal's coat had unknowingly given her both salvation and a reminder of everything lost. She held it over the railing and let fall. The diamond disappeared beneath the waves, back to the deep where it belonged, where Jack belonged. She said nothing to anyone about Jack. Some memories were too sacred for words. Some loves too big for explanation. Years passed. The world forgot. But she didn't. Not a day went by that she didn't remember the way his hand felt in hers, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. He had saved her, not just from the water, but from a life that would have drowned her long before any ocean. She married, had children, built a life. But she never forgot, and in the quiet moments, she could still hear his voice. "Promise me, Rose. You'll go on." And she did. The city skyline emerged through the gray mist like a promise unkept. New York, the destination once filled with dreams, now shadowed by loss. The Carpathia docked slowly, almost reverently, as if the ship itself understood the weight it carried. Survivors stood silently at the railings, wrapped in borrowed coats and draped in blankets, their eyes not on the new world ahead, but on the ghosts of the one they left behind. Rose stood among them. Her hair was stiff with salt, her body thin and aching from the cold, and her heart still broken in ways she hadn't begun to understand. But her eyes, those vibrant, defiant eyes, remained dry. She had wept all the tears she could for Jack in the freezing waters of the Atlantic. What was left now was memory, sharper than grief, stronger than guilt. When officials walked the deck asking for names, she hesitated. Then, with quiet resolve, she answered, "Rose Dawson." No one questioned it. No one asked more than that. The ship's manifest meant little now. The old world had been torn away, piece by piece, with the Titanic. Rose stepped off the Carpathia as a new person, built on love and loss and fire. She didn't look for Cal. She didn't need to. He had been there at the pier, of course, searching frantically among the survivors with perfectly pressed gloves and a face hardened by panic and pride. But she avoided him, slipping past unnoticed in her borrowed coat and blank stare. She was dead to him now, anyway. Rose DeWitt Bukater had died in the Atlantic. Only Rose Dawson remained. She walked the streets of New York with nothing in her pockets but Jack's memory and the clothes on her back. But she walked with purpose. She walked as someone who had seen death up close and chosen life. Her fingers still tingled from the icy water. Her skin still ached with the pressure of the lifeboat's wooden slats. But her soul had been reborn. She found work at a small dress shop, pressing pleats and hemming skirts. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't matter. She watched the world go by through the shop's front windows, the trolleys rattling over cobblestone, children skipping past with sticky fingers, jazz pouring from underground speakeasies like a secret language. It was a world Jack would have loved. She kept her promise. She didn't fade. She found a room in a boarding house with a window that faced the rising sun. Each morning, she stood before it and whispered his name. Sometimes at night, she would draw. Not like Jack had. Not with the ease of an artist who saw souls instead of faces, but with the urgency of someone trying not to forget. She sketched his smile, his hands, the curve of his jaw. She tried to remember the lines he drew of her, how gently his pencil had moved, how confidently his eyes had held her gaze. In the hush of midnight, with city lights blinking through her curtains, she could almost feel his breath on her cheek. Years moved like tides, slow, inevitable, carving the shore of her life into something new. Rose traveled when she could. She stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon and felt the same wind she had felt on the bow of Titanic. She rode horses in the Rockies, feeling the freedom in her muscles and bones. She learned to fly a biplane in 1924, laughing into the wind as the earth fell away beneath her. She felt close to Jack every time her feet left the ground. And through it all, she never told anyone. Not her landladies, not the men who asked her out with shy smiles and hopeful eyes, not the friends who would come and go in shared rooms and smoky clubs. She carried Jack with her, tucked in her chest like a heartbeat. To speak of him felt like unraveling. Eventually, she married, not for money, not for obligation, but for something gentler. A man named Sam who ran a hardware store in Oregon. He was kind, warm, and steady. He never asked about her past. He simply loved her, and in a way that was enough. They had children, 2 boys and a girl. The children had Rose's eyes and Sam's laugh. She poured her love into them, taught them to dance in the rain, to draw what they saw and speak their minds. But even then, in the quiet hours after bedtime stories and lullabies, she would sit at the edge of the porch and remember a boy on a sinking ship who had taught her to live. War came. Twice. She worked in a factory during the second, riveting airplane parts with calloused hands and fire in her heart. She saw young men off at train stations and wept with mothers who never got them back. Through all of it, Jack's voice remained in her memory. His laugh, his courage, the way he had looked at her on that last night like she was the only thing that mattered. When Sam died, she grieved him with grace and gratitude. He had given her stability, a family, a second chapter. But Jack had been her beginning. Years blurred into decades. Rose grew older, her red hair turning white, her hands marked with time. But her spirit remained untouched by the years. She became a grandmother, a great-grandmother. The stories she told were wild and wonderful, of roller coasters and cowboy rodeos, of jazz clubs in Harlem and silent film sets in California. But she never mentioned Titanic. Not once. Until the day they called her. It was 1996. The news flashed on the TV. A salvage expedition had found Titanic's wreck. They had sent submersibles 2.5 miles beneath the ocean, cameras capturing ghostly images of the great ship's bones. A man named Brock Lovett had found Cal safe, and, with it, the sketch. Her sketch. The drawing of a 17-year-old girl wearing nothing but a diamond and defiance. The moment Rose saw it on the news, her breath caught. The lines, the shading, it was all there. Her face, her heart, her secret. She picked up the phone, and the past came rushing back. They flew her out to the research vessel in a helicopter, old bones wrapped in fleece, hands trembling with age and memory. The crew treated her like royalty, but Rose ignored the fanfare. She was there for the ship, for Jack, for the truth that had waited nearly a century to be spoken. Brock asked her about the heart of the ocean, the diamond they'd been searching for. He wanted the story, the location, the glory, but she gave him something better. She gave him the truth. She sat before a camera, eyes clear as glass, voice trembling at first but gaining strength with each word. And she told it all. From the moment she boarded Titanic with her mother and Cal to the night she climbed over the rail and the boy who pulled her back. She told them about the drawing, the axe, the dance below deck, and the water that chased them through every corridor. She told them about the freezing sea and the raft and the promise. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Even Brock, so obsessed with treasure, had tears in his eyes. Later that night, when everyone slept and the stars hung above the ocean like memories strung across the sky, Rose stepped out onto the deck of the research vessel, the cold air biting her cheeks just as it had so long ago. She reached into her coat. The diamond was still there, the heart of the ocean. After all these years, she had kept it, not out of greed, but out of remembrance. It was the last piece of that life, of that moment of him. She held it in her palm and smiled. Then, with the grace of a dancer and the calm of a woman at peace, she let it go. The diamond fell, spinning slowly, disappearing beneath the waves once more. Back to Jack, back to Titanic, back to the heart of the story that never truly. The wind across the deck was sharp, but Rose hardly felt it. It was a different kind of cold now, not the bite of Atlantic water or the sting of sea spray, but a gentler chill, the kind that stirred memories rather than fear. She stood still as the ocean lapped quietly beneath the research vessel, the stars above gleaming like the ones that had watched her fall in love and survive the end of the world. The crew slept below, unaware that the most priceless treasure they saw had just returned to the deep. The diamond was gone, and with it, a piece of her heart that she had protected for more than 80 years. As she returned to her bunk, her bones weary, her chest filled with a strange, tender ache, Rose felt lighter than she had in decades. The past no longer pressed down on her. She had told the story. She had given Jack's memory a voice. He wasn't just a boy who died on a ship. He was real now, for others too, and that mattered more than any jewel ever could. She lay down under thin sheets and closed her eyes. In her dreams, the water was warm. Her skin was young again. She could hear music, not the sad kind, but the laughter-filled rhythm of fiddles and stomping feet. She stood on the grand staircase of Titanic once more. Only now there was no tilt, no chaos, no dread beneath the marble and gold. There were no crewmen rushing past or lifeboats being lowered. Only light, only joy, and Jack. He stood at the top of the stairs, wearing the tuxedo Molly Brown had lent him all those years ago, his hair tousled, his eyes alight with mischief and love. He reached out for her. She climbed slowly, not because she was old, but because she wanted to savor every step. Around them, faces filled the room. People lost the time, smiling, clapping, welcoming. There was Fabrizio, grinning ear to ear. Mr. Andrews, nodding solemnly. The band from the deck, tuning their instruments once more. Jack took her hand. "You kept your promise," he said softly. She nodded. "You gave me the strength to." They kissed. The clock behind them struck, but no time passed here. And the ocean, for the first time since that terrible night, was still. But dreams were one thing. Life, even at the end of it, still had chapters to close. Back on land, word spread that the old woman who had claimed to be the girl in the sketch was gone. The crew aboard the recovery ship spoke in whispers, replaying her story over and over, trying to decide if it had all really happened. Some said she was senile. Others said she was a miracle. Brock Lovett, once obsessed with treasure, didn't speak to the press. He watched the sun rise with the weight of a changed man. In a small, quiet home in Santa Monica, Rose's granddaughter Lizzie received the call. Her face paled. She sat down, trembling, unsure what to feel. Rose had always been vibrant, full of contradictions, funny and wise, stubborn and sweet. She told fantastic stories, most of which Lizzie had dismissed as exaggerations. But now, after the expedition, after that sketch, after the news, she sat on Rose's bed and opened the old jewelry box. Inside were letters, sketches, faded photographs, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, and a name she'd never heard Rose speak aloud, Jack Dawson. She read the letters through tears. She saw the drawing and wept harder. She realized that her grandmother, this old woman who baked pies and hummed ragtime songs on rainy days, had once stood on the edge of the world with a boy who had changed her life forever. Lizzie decided to honor her. She flew to New York, to the last remaining building that had once been Titanic's port of departure. There, she found a museum curator named Malcolm who had also met Rose years ago when the story first surfaced. Together, they reconstructed Rose's timeline, confirmed passenger records, and cross-referenced every available detail. Rose Dawson hadn't existed before April 1912, but she had existed after. And Rose DeWitt Bucator? Listed as lost at sea. Lizzie chose to keep it that way. Let her stay lost, she said, eyes filled with peace. The world tried to define her once. She chose her own name. Let's respect that. Back at home, she gathered her family, her children, and grandchildren. She told them the story. Not the watered-down version. Not the one you'd find in history books, but the real one. The one her grandmother had lived. The one that mattered. They listened, spellbound, as the past came alive again. And somewhere deep beneath the ocean, Titanic rested quietly, the ghosts aboard a little less restless, their stories finally told. Divers continued to visit the wreck in the years that followed, but none ever found the heart of the ocean. Some searched for it still, convinced it had slipped from a careless hand or that it had never truly existed. But Rose knew, and so did Lizzie. It wasn't about the diamond. It never had been. It was about memory, about love, about how a brief, beautiful encounter could alter the course of a life forever. Back in her home, Lizzie framed the sketch of Rose. She hung it above the piano in the light where it could be seen. Her daughter asked her once who drew it. Someone who saw her, she answered simply. Someone who really saw her. Years passed again. Titanic was remembered in books, films, and documentaries. Its story retold again and again, each version adding layers, but never quite capturing the whole truth. But in that quiet house, where an old woman once lived and loved and remembered, the real story lingered like the scent of sea air after a storm. A love story that defied time, a tragedy that birthed a new life, and a promise kept across oceans and years. The world moved on, as it always did. Time doesn't pause for love, or memory, or even for legends resting at the bottom of the sea. But in the shadows of what remained, in the quiet corners where history softened into myth, Titanic lived on. Not just as a shipwreck, but as a moment frozen in time. A heartbeat echoing across generations. A story whispered in the rust of her steel bones and in the eyes of those who still dared to dream. For the people who'd heard Rose's story, who truly listened, it changed something. Brock Lovett, who had once chased artifacts and price tags, walked away from the business not long after that final voyage. He donated his entire private collection of recovered Titanic items to maritime museums across the world. And for the rest of his life, he refused to speak of the diamond. When asked, he'd only smile a little sad and say, "Some things aren't meant to be found." He returned to the ocean sometimes, not for treasure, but for peace. He would drop a single red rose into the sea on every anniversary of the sinking, letting it drift on the waves. Not because he had to, but because some stories demand remembrance. Lizzie, Rose's granddaughter, went on to publish a memoir, not about the Titanic herself, but about her grandmother. Titled Becoming Rose Dawson, it became a quiet bestseller, not for its shock or scandal, but for its soul. In it, she included photographs of the sketch, of Rose's art, and of the strange, winding trail that led from privilege to poverty to peace. Readers cried. Some reached out with their own family stories of lost love, of reinvention, of starting over. And Lizzie read every letter. She would sit sometimes at the beach, where her grandmother used to watch the horizon in silence. She'd think of that girl who once stood on the stern of Titanic, wind in her hair, arms outstretched, as though daring the world to let her fly. The girl who ran from a cage, fell into the sea, and survived not because she was strong, but because someone believed in her. Someone who'd drawn her picture like she was worth seeing. And she'd whisper into the breeze, "Thank you, Jack." Down beneath the waves, Titanic slept. Her once magnificent hulls now ghostly corridors, cloaked in coral and algae. The grand staircase had collapsed long ago. The boilers lay still, silent in a frozen time. The ocean had taken so much, but not everything. There was still something human in those wrecked walls. Something sacred. Every now and then, deep-sea ROVs would pass through, sending back flickering images to scientists and historians. They studied, they speculated, they guessed. But no one ever saw the heart of the ocean again. And maybe that was fitting, because some treasures aren't meant to be displayed in glass cases or measured in carats. Some are meant to live in memory, in that space between longing and loss, between the past and the present. Years passed, then decades, a century, and still Titanic fascinated. People built models, wrote ballads, filmed reenactments. She became not just a ship, but a symbol of human ambition and frailty, of wealth and poverty, of fate and courage, and of love. Always love. One day, a young couple stood at the Titanic Museum in Belfast, Ireland, looking at the final manifest. She traced a finger down the names, pausing at Rose Dawson, New York. A small plaque had been added beside the display, updated after Lizzie's memoir. It read, "Believed to have survived under this name. Identity confirmed decades later through private testimony and artifacts." She chose to live free and anonymously after the tragedy. Her story was finally told by family in the late 20th century. The couple stared in silence for a while. "She made it," the woman said, "and told no one for so long." Sometimes, when something hurts too much, the woman said quietly, "You have to bury it until it's ready to bloom." The man squeezed her hand. Outside, the wind carried the salt of the Atlantic. The sea never forgot. Back in America, an old tree bloomed every spring beside a cottage Rose had once called home. Beneath it lay a small marker with no name, just a carving of a sketchbook and a rose in bloom. It wasn't a grave. Rose had chosen to be cremated and scattered at sea. But Lizzie had planted the tree, quietly and without ceremony, as a place to remember. A place to honor a woman who had lived more than one life. Visitors didn't come often, but when they did, they always left something behind. A flower, a sketch, a note. Sometimes a necklace with a blue pendant, gently laid at the roots. Titanic had taken over 1,500 lives. It had scarred the world. But for one woman, it had also given her freedom. And in her final years, Rose had understood that. She didn't regret the past. Not the pain. Not the loss. Because in the depth of that one, brief romance, she had learned what it meant to be seen. To be truly alive. Jack had told her once, "Make it count." And she had. Every single day. Even in the stillness of old age, in the silence of rooms filled with fading photographs and dreams, she had counted it all. Every breath, every brushstroke, every grandchild's laugh, every step forward, even the wobbly ones with a cane. All of it lived with color and intention. Back on the sea, a little boy stood on the deck of a ferry, staring down at the water. He didn't know the story. Not yet. But something in the waves stirred him, a mystery, a pull. His mother, behind him, called his name. He turned once more to the water and whispered a question he didn't understand. "Were you really there?" And somewhere deep in the ocean, a ship remembered. Rust creaked. The silt shifted. A current moved gently past the ruined dining hall, through the ghostly shell of the promenade, brushing lightly against a metal railing where two lovers had once stood, flying. And for just a moment the world didn't notice, the wreck seemed to breathe, not with sadness, but with peace.